What seem like insignificant acts can become everything. An apple pie brought across a field one Tuesday morning. A simple wooden porch. There was a man who had lost the ability to anticipate kindness, and a woman who, for 3 years, had brought kindness without being requested and without tallying it. At 25, Margaret Hale had spent her whole life on the adjacent land. She understood the Callaway Ranch intimately, just like her own hands. The creak of the gate, the distinctive sag of the aging barn, the way sunrise painted the Rocky Mountains gold for a few moments. And she knew Thomas Callaway as well. A five-year-old widower, Thomas was the sort hardened by life into either resentment or stillness. He chose stillness. He tended his fields, honored his promises, and had spent 3 years getting used to a house far too big for one. Since Eleanor's passing, she had been bringing him meals not from pity, but from that special solicitude you show to someone you've observed bearing a great weight for years. One Tuesday in September, she arrived with an apple pie. He gazed at the pie, then at her, and then gave that rare smile that transformed his entire expression. "Ha ha. If only I were 10 years younger," he joked, intending it to be humorous. Her look was unreadable to him, because for Margaret Hale, it was anything but a joke. Eleanor Callaway had passed away in the spring of 1880. The death wasn't sudden. The sickness lingered deliberately, as illnesses do when they aim to be exhaustive. Thomas stayed by her side throughout, and when it ended, he laid her to rest beneath the cottonwood tree east of the house. The next morning, he returned to work because labor was the only sensible thing left. That became the story people told about Thomas Callaway, that he was back at work by sunrise. Some spoke of it with admiration, others with worry. Thomas himself held no view on the matter. He just had no other recourse. Margaret had known Eleanor intimately. The families had lived side by side for 3 decades, Margaret's parents to the south, the Callaways to the north. Eleanor was the type who turned a neighborhood into a true community. After her death, a warmth that had always been present grew silent. Margaret began delivering meals 2 weeks after the service. Not daily. She managed her own 40-acre property, which demanded all her focus. Her parents had relocated to Denver to live closer to her sister. Every Tuesday, she arrived with a pot of stew, or bread, or a pie when the apples were ripe. Thomas would receive it with the same phrase, "You didn't need to." And Margaret would reply consistently, "I know." This ritual repeated so often, it evolved into a sort of dialogue. Their exchange was a shorthand for something neither scrutinized too deeply. Over 3 years of Tuesdays, Thomas observed that Margaret Hale was remarkably competent. She managed the southern property single-handedly, never complaining and never seeking unnecessary assistance. She mended her own fences, haggled her own cattle prices at Durango's market, and secured better deals than the men. She commanded twice the price through preparation and precise knowledge of value. He had also noticed and promptly suppressed the noticing that she was very pleasant company. Their porch conversations were always engaging. She held strong opinions and voiced them without hesitation. She laughed at his remarks even when he wasn't certain they were amusing. She inquired about his cattle and truly paid attention to his responses. He had mentally filed all of this, without too much analysis, under the label good neighbor. It was a safe category that demanded nothing extra from him. He planned to keep her there forever. That is, until that Tuesday morning when she showed up with the apple pie. He made his remark, and she gave him that particular look. And without his consent, the category silently began to crumble. The town of Durango had its own views on Margaret Hale, which came as no shock. In 1883, Durango was a burgeoning town. The railroad had come 2 years earlier, ushering in trade, newcomers, and that distinctive vitality of a town convinced it's on the rise. And such towns hold opinions on everything, particularly regarding young women who manage their own land and appear to need no rescue. The opinion that worried Margaret most involved Daniel Marsh. Daniel, age 28, was the son of Durango's wealthiest shopkeeper. His handsomeness had the polished quality of a man long aware of his own appeal. He had been hinting at his romantic interest in Margaret since last spring. Not pushily, he was far too suave for such bluntness. He would drop off gifts, show up at the market on her usual days, and utter the correct words in the proper tone. The town wholeheartedly endorsed him. He was youthful and wealthy, and everyone concurred that he would be a perfect match for Margaret Hale. Margaret, beautiful and competent, would exhaust herself managing that property solo unless she took care. In the dry goods store, Martha Greer told Margaret straight up that Daniel Marsh was a decent fellow and she could end up with far worse. Margaret expressed thanks, purchased her flour, and kept quiet. Her friend Ruth, aged 27 and newly married, thus considered an expert on these things, was more direct. He's inquired about you 3 times this month. 3 times, Margaret. When are you going to give him a chance? When I feel like it, Margaret, she replied sweetly. And when might that be? Margaret turned her gaze to the western mountains, those Colorado peaks, forever present, dependable, and perfectly themselves. I don't know, she said, though that wasn't completely honest. She had a pretty good idea of when she'd want to give Daniel Marsh a chance. Basically never. The real reason she couldn't voice yet, because speaking it would bring it to life. And real things come with consequences. She had baked the pie on a Monday evening, using fine apples from the tree at the south edge of her land, the ones that turn sweet in September. She prepared the crust exactly as her mother instructed, using cold butter and cold hands, not over-kneading, and she fluted the edges with great care. Later, she'd confessed to herself that her meticulousness exceeded what the situation truly demanded. On Tuesday morning, she transported it across the field beneath a sky, behaving exactly as Colorado skies do in September, an implausibly vivid blue that turns everything beneath it into a painting. Thomas was already on the porch when she got there, which was typical for Tuesday mornings, as if he had memorized the pattern of her visits without ever admitting it. He sipped coffee and stared at the mountains with that special stillness of someone who has come to terms with mornings. She climbed the porch steps and offered the pie. He inspected it with sincere admiration. Thomas Calloway was the type who truly valued a properly made pie, and Margaret had always seen that as a mark in his favor. "Apple," he commented. "September apples. The best kind," she replied. He glanced at the pie and then at her, and slowly a rare smile spread across his face, transforming his entire expression, making him appear like a younger version of himself. He said, "If only I were 10 years younger." He uttered it softly, the way you say something intended to settle lightly and be forgotten. Margaret looked at him. The Colorado morning enveloped them both. A hawk wheeled above, and the mountains continued their eternal stillness. 10 years wouldn't be enough, she responded, and before he could wrap his head around that, she placed the pie on the porch railing. She announced she needed to check on the cattle and strode back across the field. Thomas remained on his porch, gazing first at the pie, then at her disappearing form, then back at the pie. He remained there for a very long time. Then he went indoors, refilled his coffee, took a seat at the kitchen table, and pondered her words. He mulled them over for the entire day and, truth be told, for much longer. On a Wednesday, Daniel Marsh showed up at Margaret's place carrying flowers, not wildflowers, but arranged ones, the kind you'd buy at a shop. He had sent for them from Denver, indicating he had made a plan. Margaret accepted them with the same warmth she showed everything, but inside she had the distinct response of a woman fully aware of what flowers from Denver imply. She wasn't sure how to handle the situation without being rude, so she placed them in water. She offered him coffee, and Daniel settled at her kitchen table with the comfort of a man used to being invited. He spoke about his father's significant new supply deal with the railroad. He related the details with the humble pride of someone who intends to inform you of something, yet tries not to seem like he's bragging. She admitted to herself that he wasn't a bad man, he was agreeable and affluent. Practically speaking, he would be a completely sensible option. The town had that much correct. He requested to escort her to the harvest social at the end of October. "I'll consider it," she replied, which was both polite and truthful. That answer bought her some time, though she wasn't quite sure how to use it. Once he was gone, she lingered by the kitchen window, gazing across the field at the Calloway Ranch. The late afternoon sun illuminated the mountains, and the barn threw a long shadow over the golden grass. Somewhere out there, Thomas was engaged in his usual late afternoon activities, which she knew because she had been observant for 3 years. He was likely inspecting the northern fence line. She stared at the mountains and reflected on 10 years wouldn't be enough, and what exactly she had meant by that. Furthermore, she wondered if she was acting foolishly, and if so, whether foolishness even mattered. After a lengthy pause at the window, she concluded that foolishness was far less significant than she had once thought. Before we continue, I'd love to know which country you're tuned in from today. Leave it in the comments. Whether you're in the United States, Australia, Canada, or Ireland, it truly matters to me to know where this voice is reaching. Let's return to the story, because Thomas Calloway is on the verge of an important realization. Thomas wasn't the type to rush through his thoughts. He was methodical and cautious. He examined situations like tilling earth, scrutinizing everything beneath the surface before determining how to proceed. He pondered her statement, 10 years wouldn't be enough. Over the next couple of weeks, he mended the north fence, relocated the cattle to the winter pasture, fixed the east side of the barn roof, and had 3 discussions with his horse Gerald, an old, philosophically minded creature. Their talks revolved around the nature of unexpected arrivals. Gerald's input in these chats was minimal, but he listened sincerely. On the 14th day, Thomas rode to Durango for supplies. At the feed store, he learned that Daniel Marsh had invited Margaret Hale to the harvest social. He also discovered that Margaret had replied she would think it over, which most people interpreted as a near certainty. Thomas gathered his supplies, rode home, and stabled his horse. He then sat on the porch, the very place where he had made that comment. His eyes fell upon the spot on the railing where she had placed the pie. He reflected on a woman who had walked across that field every Tuesday for 3 years, never asking for anything in return. He also thought about Eleanor, not with guilt. Eleanor had passed away 3 years ago, and in life she was a woman of immense practical wisdom. She had often told him that being stubborn in the wrong direction was merely stupidity disguised as resolve. Reflecting on what Eleanor might have said about this particular moment, he felt quite confident he could guess. Stepping inside, he studied his own image. In the tiny mirror beside the kitchen entrance, he saw the gray strands, the creases, the 55 years of Colorado climate etched across his features. He then held that particular dialogue with his own reflection, the kind a man engages in when persuading himself toward a decision. His wiser self had already made up its mind, and it prevailed. Donning his hat, he strode across the meadow. She was repairing the southern boundary fence when he arrived, standing not on her land but at the dividing line that separated their properties, a zone that was, by mutual understanding, neutral ground. Pausing at the fence, he rested his palms on the uppermost bar. His gaze carried that familiar look he always had when he'd reached a firm resolution and intended to stick with it. She continued her task, not looking up. Over the course of 3 years, she had come to understand that Thomas Calloway spoke when he was ready, and that patience yielded better results than any prodding. "Margaret," he called out. "Thomas," she responded, still not raising her gaze. "I've been mulling over what you told me." "Which part?" "You're well aware which part." She placed her fencing implement on the ground and finally met his eyes. 10 years wouldn't be sufficient, he said. "I've been thinking about what that meant." He then asked, "And what did you conclude?" A silence settled between them. The Colorado afternoon enveloped them both, the peaks, the amber fields, that distinctive September radiance that lends everything an aura of both stark reality and distant recollection. "I decided," he said slowly, "that I don't understand your meaning, and that I would like to." His gaze dropped to the fence rail. "I'm 55, I recognize what that signifies and what it doesn't," he said, lifting his eyes to meet hers. "And I won't act as if it's insignificant. But I'd like to hear if you're open to explaining." She studied him, this cautious, gentle, utterly honorable man. For 3 years, he had welcomed her Tuesday visits without ever questioning her motives. "It meant," she explained, "that 10 years wouldn't transform you into someone more like what I'd been seeking, because you're already precisely that." The fence line fell into a deep silence. A hawk soared across the Colorado sky overhead. As Thomas Calloway gazed at Margaret Hale, he sensed something take root in his heart, something he never thought he would experience a second time. It wasn't a mere reminder of the past. It was a completely fresh feeling, appearing unbidden and unapologetic. The harvest social would be held on the final Saturday in October. Margaret attended. Thomas stayed away. He hadn't set foot at a social event since Eleanor's passing, and he still wasn't prepared for one. Margaret grasped this without any explanation required. Daniel Marsh happened to be present. Daniel was winsome, considerate, and an excellent dancer, attributes Margaret honestly recognized. He fetched her a cup of a warm beverage. Then he stood by her side with the relaxed confidence of someone who feels everything is going his way. It was Martha Greer who voiced the observation. Martha was a kind-hearted woman, yet possessed a bluntness born from viewing social niceties as a waste of time. "I've heard you've been frequenting the Callaway Ranch," she remarked to Margaret in a voice that was more statement than inquiry. "Thomas is my neighbor," Margaret replied. "He's lived there my whole life, and he's 55. I'm perfectly conscious of that." "Margaret," Martha said, placing her cup aside, "Daniel Marsh is just 20 feet from here, 28 years old, with a father who controls half the supply deals in the county. I mention this because I have your best interests at heart." Margaret glanced at Daniel across the gathering. He was indisputably 28, wealthy, and utterly appropriate. Daniel noticed her gaze and offered a smile, which she returned. Then she turned to Martha. "Do you happen to know what Thomas Callaway did the day my fence collapsed in the spring flood?" she asked. "He arrived the very next morning with timber he could scarcely afford to give away, and he never once brought it up afterwards." She paused for effect. "That's no trivial gesture, Martha, and that was the crux of it." She departed the social ahead of schedule. Riding home under the Colorado night sky with the mountain silhouettes cutting darkly against the stars, she pondered the entire situation and what it truly signified to recognize the full picture when it was right in front of you. Daniel Marsh embodied everything the community desired for her future, yet Thomas Callaway was the one she personally desired. Observing her mother's cautious choices and her sister's impulsive ones had taught her that those two preferences seldom aligned. November arrived, bringing with it the distinct sharpness of late autumn Colorado. The aspens had turned golden and then shed their leaves. The mountain peaks bore the season's first dusting of snow. The air held that crisp, clean quality of a season that makes no compromises. Meanwhile, Thomas had been undertaking something nothing showy, nothing he publicized or called attention to. Margaret observed it, just as she noticed every detail of the Callaway Ranch, gradually over her visits, the way one perceives a garden's steady growth. The porch railing he'd intended to repair for 2 years had finally been mended. The east-facing kitchen window now sported a fresh frame. The spare bedroom, the one that had stored Eleanor's belongings, sealed shut for 3 years, stood open and aired. The lingering heaviness of the past had been softly swept away. Margaret took in every change but remained silent. Then, on a Thursday rather than his usual Tuesday, he appeared at her door, a detail she certainly registered. "I've been handling some repairs around the house," he explained as she opened the door. "I'm aware," she replied. "You notice then?" "Thomas, I've been coming to that home for 3 years. I observe everything." He glanced down at his hat, which he was nervously rotating in his hands. "I want to ask you something, and I want to do it the right way." She waited patiently. "Daniel Marsh is a decent fellow," he began. "I'm aware of that. The whole town knows that he's 28, with bright prospects, and every logical reason sides with him." Raising his eyes to meet hers, he said, "I'm 55. I own a ranch that constantly requires attention, a porch I've only just repaired, and a kitchen window I installed only last week. I can't rival reasonable arguments." "Then don't try," she answered. He gazed at her. "Would you permit me to court you?" he asked formally, hat in hand. She examined the man standing on her porch, his 55 years. The repaired railing, the guest room he'd prepared. She greeted him, "Thomas Callaway, I've been expecting your arrival for nearly 3 years." He took in her words, processing them quietly. "I'm aware," he replied. She invited him inside, mentioning coffee. The town of Durango naturally had its views on the matter. Martha Greer expressed her surprise openly. Ruth proclaimed it romantic, even more loudly. Daniel Marsh handled it with grace, boosting Margaret's regard for him slightly. Within a month, he courted a Denver banker's daughter, raising her opinion further. Reverend Cole remarked directly to Thomas about the significant age gap, a brave move Thomas appreciated, even though he disagreed with the Reverend's stance. "She's 25, Thomas noted. The Reverend countered, "and in 20 years, you'll be 75. 20 years from now," Thomas mused, "I'll be 75, but she will have spent 2 decades with a man who truly sees her and keeps his word." He paused. "That seems valuable to me." The Reverend considered this, gave a single nod, and married them 4 months later. Their courtship proceeded with the easy pace of old friends acknowledging a long-standing truth. No dramatic displays, just shared meals and heartfelt conversations. Sunday afternoons found them riding across Colorado's terrain, through aspen groves, mountain meadows, and along the creeks separating their lands. Margaret settled into the Callaway Ranch in March 1884, as the final snow melted from the peaks and the first hints of green emerged in the lower pastures. She arrived with her books, her mother's pie recipe, and a practical skill that revitalized the ranch's finances in just 1 month. Thomas observed her settling into the home effortlessly, like water finding its own level. One April evening, she discovered him on the porch, gazing at the mountains with a look she recognized as his contentment. She joined him. "Are you happy?" she inquired, her tone sincere rather than worried. He stared at the peaks briefly. "I stopped anticipating happiness," he admitted, "but that's different from lacking it." Turning to her, he stated simply, "I am happy," with the same straightforwardness he used for all important things. She clasped his hand. The Colorado dusk enveloped them. Their wedding took place on a Saturday in February 1884 at the Durango Church, with a congregation that held strong opinions and was curious to see the outcome. Margaret chose a dress in deep green. Reminiscent of Colorado pines, she wasn't one to blindly follow rules that didn't feel right to her. Thomas, in his finest jacket, stood at the altar watching her approach. With the wisdom of 55 years, he grasped that certain things come when you've quit searching, and they're no less genuine for being late. The ranch became truly theirs, not his with her added, but a shared possession. She managed the finances, which improved dramatically in the first 3 months. He tended the cattle and fences, drawing on decades of intimate land knowledge. Their division of labor was based on skill, not tradition. So Thomas sometimes cooked while Margaret fixed fence posts. Neither thought it unusual. Their son William was born in January 1885, named after Thomas's father. He inherited his mother's red hair and his father's thoughtful, observant nature, marking him as someone intriguing from the start. Thomas was 57 years old at the time. He had voiced his concerns to Margaret with characteristic caution. "Will I be sufficient?" he asked, without drama but earnestly. She replied matter-of-factly, "You repaired my fence the morning after a flood," and said nothing more on the subject. Her look conveyed, "That's what a father does," and, indeed, he never questioned it again. One September morning in 1886, 3 years after the pie, the jest, in that porch encounter, Thomas worked at the north fence. He spotted Margaret crossing the field, carrying red-haired, solemn-faced William on her hip. No pie in sight. The boy gazed at the mountains with a child's intent, storing memories. She reached the fence. Thomas opened the gate. She passed him the child, who regarded him with eyes that were not Eleanor's but Margaret's, bright, direct, and utterly fearless. Thomas cradled his son, glanced at his wife, then at the familiar Colorado mountains. He reflected on that Tuesday 3 years ago. A pie and a joke that turned out to be no joke at all. And a woman who once wore an unreadable expression, now he understood it perfectly. "If only I were a decade younger," he stated, not jokingly or evasively, but as a man recognizing what he nearly overlooked. Margaret gazed back with that same look that had set everything in motion. 10 years wouldn't have sufficed," she replied. "I needed precisely you." William glanced between them with the peaceful confusion of a 1-year-old, who wouldn't grasp this tale for many years yet would be raised within its affection. Thomas returned the boy to his mother and latched the gate. He strode across the field with his family under the Colorado sun, filled with gratitude beyond any calculation or age arithmetic, grateful that he had made that pie worth a foolish comment. Thomas Callaway had nearly talked himself out of the best thing to ever come his way, not due to stubbornness or pride, but due to arithmetic. He tallied his years and deemed them excessive. He calculated the gap between 55 and 25 and decided it made him ineligible. He was acting responsibly and realistically, but as Margaret would later say with her dry patience, he was mistaken. Age carries genuine weight and consequences. Anyone denying it isn't observant. Thomas knew Margaret understood that they never deluded themselves about it. But Thomas had mistakenly equated the tally of years with the measure of worth. After counting them, he decided he possessed too much of one aspect and too little of another. Margaret measured things differently. She valued the man who delivered lumber on the morning after the flood. She recognized the man who spoke honestly and stood by his words. She appreciated the man who smiled infrequently, yet each smile was heartfelt. That is not someone weighed down by age. That is someone who spent 55 years becoming his true self. And at times, not always, but sometimes the person who sees that most clearly is the one who has been observing from the far side of the field. Do not let the counting stop you from asking the question. Do not let the date on the calendar persuade you that what you bring is insufficient. It might be just enough. It might be precisely what someone has been longing for, across a field on a Tuesday morning, holding a pie in her hands. Before I leave today, I want to say this to anyone who stayed until the end of the story. Thank you from the heart. You gave me a precious gift, your time and focus, and I never take either for granted. These stories exist because of you. Every comment, every like, every person who shares an episode with someone they believe could use a quiet hour. That is what sustains this. Wherever you are today, whether it is morning or evening, whether the sun is shining or the stars are glowing, I hope this story left you with something warm to hold in your heart. May God bless every single one of you who listened today, each and every one. Until next time, keep riding.